Radio 1, The Inside Scene, the story of Britain's favourite radio station, BBC Radio 1. Read by the author Johnny Beerling, who produced the first ever programme in 1967 and who was controller of the station from 1985 to 1993. Chapter 1, Context. In the 1960s, the radio world was a very different one from that to which we are accustomed today. For people who wanted to listen to popular music of the day, there was little choice. You either bought the records you wanted to hear and played them at home, or you listened to Radio Luxembourg on 208 metres in the medium wave. Its signal suffered from interference and it faded in and out in most parts of the country. The BBC had a light programme service which covered the country, but there weren't all that many all-record programmes. Housewife's Choice for 55 minutes every morning. Two-way family favourites on Sunday lunchtime. Those were the big shows, but these were compiled from a broad range of records. At lunchtime every weekday there was Midday Spin, and at weekends Pete Murray and David Jacobs entertained for a couple of hours in the evenings. Those with experience of American radio spotted a gap in the market, and in the early 60s a range of pirate stations were set up to broadcast all-day pop music. Although they were illegal because they paid no copyright fees for the music and transmitted on frequencies to which they had no right, they soon developed a huge following, particularly among the youth of the country. By 1965 the BBC had started to respond, but it was a slow response and involved an increase in the number and style of their pop music shows. The overproduced scripted approach of the light programme DJs didn't match that of the free and easy ad-libbing pirates. It was hampered by a lack of funds, and I suspect by a lack of BBC management enthusiasm for this sector of the market. It was time to rethink the whole structure of domestic broadcasting. Broadcasting in the 70s was the title of a policy document which set off a reorganisation of the whole of domestic radio broadcasting. Instead of the old home, light and third programmes, there would be 4 national networks broadcasting broadly on generic lines. These would be complemented by a chain of local radio stations broadcasting across England. Thus emerged the following shape for the networks: Radio 1, Popular Music; Radio 2, Light Music, Sport and Entertainment; Radio 3, Music and Cultural Spoken Word; Radio 4, News, Drama, Education, and so on. These 4 national networks were born on September the 27th, 1967, and of course that was the start of BBC Radio 1. This was the network which was to consume my life for the next 26 years. During that time I started as a producer of the first ever Tony Blackburn breakfast show and finished in total charge of the network. From that position I had a unique insight into everything. Chapter 2, In the Beginning.
Well, there we end broadcasting in the light programme, not just for today, but as it seems forever. The light programme, that is, as it's known now, is closing down. But in only a few hours' time, the BBC with Paul Hollingdale will open up on 247 metres and 1500 metres and VHF. That's at 5:30. And then at 7 o'clock on 247 metres, Tony Blackburn will open and swing into our new Radio 1 network. We hope you'll be with us, not only at 5:30, but if you like pop music, as it should be played and should be introduced, in this case with Tony Blackburn, then switch over or switch on to 247 at 7 o'clock.
Those were the words of the late Roger Moffat, closing down the old light programme on September the 29th, 1967. On Saturday, September the 30th, Paul Hollingdale presented the early show on both Radio 1 and 2, starting at 05:30, and we were waiting in the next-door studio, ready to go. Tony had done all the tests with the technical operator, given volume checks on his microphone and jingles. To say we were nervous is an understatement. There were too many people crowding around in the cramped confines of that little continuity studio, and too many of them were top BBC brass. And there was a TV camera crew to record the event for posterity. It didn't make for a relaxed atmosphere. Although it was the end of September and the air conditioning was running flat out, it felt warm. As it got nearer to lift-off, I looked around the studio covered with Radio 1 posters, and I glanced at the faces of those present as we heard Paul Hollingdale introduce his last record. His show was winding down. Head of Radio 1 programmes Derek Chinnery was just as excited as the rest of us, but his eyes looked worried behind his horn-rimmed glasses. Tony was still smiling nervously as he checked and rechecked that his first disc was queued up and all his tape cartridges were in the right slots. We had rehearsed this over and over, but I still worried. My stomach was knotted with expectation, and I wiped my face with a handkerchief and once again made sure my stopwatch was fully wound. It wasn't really necessary, but for years I'd got used to timing the actual durations of the records as they went out for accurate music reporting, and so that I could warn Tony when each disc was coming to an end. He didn't need it, he knew them all too well, but it gave me something to do. After all, as the show's producer, I was responsible. As Paul's last record ended, he closed the show to the strains of George Martin's Theme 1. It was one of the few times when it was played in full, and at 06:59 Robin Scott, the controller, swallowed and launched into his little introductory speech, ending,
10 seconds to go before Radio 1, Tony Blackburn, and Radio 2, Paul Hollingdale. Stand by for switching. Get tuned to Radio 1 or 2. 5, 4, 3. Radio 2, Radio 1, go.
The jingle sang out.
The voice of Radio 1. Just for fun. Music too much.
Tony spoke the words which I now know off by heart.
And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the exciting new sound of Radio 1.
And that was it. We were on the air. Tony's imaginary dog, Arnold, behaved himself, and the corny jokes and exhortations to get out of bed, throw open the window, and shout out to everyone that Radio 1 is wonderful passed by uneventfully. Arnold was to come back and haunt Tony years later when he was doing the Radio 1 Roadshow, as I remember seeing a banner being held up with the legend, Arnold is a woofter. Chapter 3. Early Radio Waves. Nearly 18 years later, I was sitting in my new office on a January day in 1985. A wintry sun shone through the dusty windows as I realised what a wonderful, if frightening, position I was in. A couple of days before, my boss, the outgoing controller of Radio 1, Derek Chinnery, had called me in to say the board had selected me to be his successor. With effect from March 1985, I would be controller of the biggest popular radio station in the UK, if not the world. The enormity of the role caused a few butterflies to flutter in my tummy. Just what does a controller do? Well, you may well ask. It's one of those unique BBC titles. In any other organisation, the person totally in charge would be the managing director. But we can't have a title like that because that's reserved for the boss of all the controllers. So in a nutshell, the controller of a network is responsible for all aspects of that network, answerable only to the managing director of the directorate, in my case the radio directorate. I would have a budget, a production staff to manage, airtime to fill, on-air talent to hire and fire, and a schedule of programs to fill. As far as the public is concerned, the controller is the person to take the blame for what comes out of the loudspeaker. What a responsibility. Having been employed by the BBC for 28 years, I wasn't altogether ignorant about the responsibilities of the job, and for the last couple of years had actively thought about the possibility of getting it, and what I might do with the network if they ever put me in charge. There was no shortage of popular talent. These were the DJs on the books: Richard Skinner, Bruno Brooks, Mark Page, Paul Gambaccini, Gary Bird, Mike Reed, Adrian John, Gary Davis, Steve Wright, Paul Jordan, Jimmy Savile, Anne Nightingale, Pete Drummond, Janice Long, Adrian Just, Dave Lee Travis, John Peel, Jeff Young, Dixie Peach, Anne-Marie Gray, Simon Bates, Peter Powell, Tommy Vance, and Andy Peebles. I was like a football manager with perhaps too many players on the payroll. It wasn't enough to keep playing the same tactics with the same old team. I was proud of the large audiences we had, but knew we would be up against more and more competition as commercial radio expanded and as daytime television increased its hours. The Radio 1 listeners were all growing older. We needed to attract new, younger ones, and the BBC itself was undergoing self-examination about its role as the major UK broadcaster. I was tired of having the network regarded by the BBC establishment as something second class. It deserved proper recognition, and it deserved to be heard in FM stereo in the same quality as the other networks. I vowed that would be one of my first priorities, coupled with a desire to provide this service 24 hours a day. This would need plenty of capital expenditure. It was also time Radio 1 grew up even more. I'd heard all the allegations about pop and prattle, and if we were to argue the case for a successful renewal of our charter, including a continuation of the Radio 1 service, we had to be better than and different from commercial radio. So I was determined that we should have as much credibility musically as Radio 3. To achieve this, we needed to employ knowledgeable and talented presenters and to secure broadcasting rights to the biggest concerts everywhere. I wanted to ensure that we played as wide a selection of music as we could, from new talent as well as from existing bands. What we needed was a close look at the current on-air talent, a shake-up of the tired ones, and to provide motivation for the producers to keep their shows fresh. I knew that in order to justify the universal licence fee, the BBC needed Radio 1's huge audience, so that we could argue everyone used one or other of the BBC networks at some time. The challenge would be to grow up without losing too many listeners. More promotion than ever was the key, even if it meant spending money on advertising, tie-ups with newspapers, cross-promotion from BBC television. The BBC TV had huge audiences, yet at that time there was no cross-promotion. Having started my executive career producing The Beatles Story, I wanted to ensure we continued to inform our audience about the background to the music we played by making excellent documentaries. On the subject of information, I knew that for many of our younger listeners, Radio 1 was the only source of current affairs and news, so I wanted to improve our Newsbeat operation. Perhaps there should be more airtime for Newsbeat, and the commissioning of Newsbeat specials when events justified it. More involvement and association between Radio 1 and the Newsbeat staff to break down the us, the music men, versus them, the newsmen situation. Social action broadcasting, too, would become increasingly important, as it was the only way of reaching a socially disadvantaged section of the population. I needed a sympathetic colleague to get a grip of that and ensure it was done right and that the funding came in. We could do with a free helpline which listeners could use to answer their worries, and as I scribbled down these various problems, I started to daydream in the afternoon sun. Perhaps it was too many celebratory drinks at lunchtime. My mind started to wander. Oh God, I'm going into one of those awful spinning clichés they use in films, when your mind starts to wander and you go all giddy. I'm going back in time. How did I start? What led me to this unique position? I was born the eldest of 3 children at Westmarsh, near Canterbury, Kent, on April the 12th, 1937. Dad, Raymond Starr Beerling, had started life as a gardener and now had his own market garden. He employed one paid worker, Ron Fagg, and another unpaid one, my mum, May Elizabeth Julia. Dad was a kindly, self-taught man with a keen interest in all things technical, while Mum came from farming stock, the only girl she was among 9 brothers. This probably accounted for her robust personality, which she used to influence the men in her life. She certainly was a major influence on me. We had never heard of FM broadcasting. It was all AM on short, medium or long waves. As far back as I can remember, Dad's main hobby was radio, and he taught himself how these things worked and built many sets of his own. Naturally, we were very much a radio-dominated family, so I grew up with the wireless from my earliest days. These radios, of course, were all battery-driven, no mains electricity in our village, and each week we used to cycle to the nearby village of Ash to collect a recharged accumulator from the local garage. The war started when I was 2, and of course Dad was in Dad's army, the Home Guard. My earliest memories are of him coming home on a Sunday lunchtime, clad in his ill-fitting rough khaki uniform with an empty rifle and a string of bangers which were used to represent rifle fire on exercises. He was certainly no Captain Mannering, more a Sergeant Wilson. We had an Anderson bomb shelter in the kitchen in which we had to sleep when there was an air raid warning, and one day we dived into it when we heard the sound of an approaching aircraft. the village was being strafed by a rogue German fighter. The pilot was probably lost and using up his ammunition, but the machine gun bullets hit the outside of the house where Dad had propped up his bike, and when we emerged there was a line of bullet holes, some of them through the metal chain guard. I can't remember the exact words he used, I was probably too young to understand them, but I believe he considered the pilot's parents to be unmarried at the time of his birth. I wondered, was this an early lesson in ducking and diving? I passed the 11+ exam and went to Sir Roger Manwood's grammar school in nearby Sandwich. Not a lot of laughs there, so we'll gloss over that. Following in Dad's footsteps, I built my own record players, amplifiers and radios. Many nights I would drift off to sleep listening to the sound of Willis Conover's Jazz Hour on the Voice of America, or Radio Luxembourg, where Pearl Carr and Teddy Johnson, Mr. and Mrs. Music as they were known, had their own show singing with the Jeff Love Orchestra. Humphrey Littleton also had his own show with the band, and there were many record programs featuring top DJs like Don Moss, Barry Aldis and Jack Jackson. There weren't any discos as such. For entertainment we went to the church youth club, and our idea of a big night out was to go to the Coronation Ballroom at Ramsgate, where we could bop to the music of the big bands of the day. My favourite was Ted Heath with his 3-star singers, Lita Rosa, Dickie Valentine and Dennis Lotis. My love of big bands started here, and that's stayed with me ever since. In 1955 came the call to arms, national service for 2 years. With my CCF and semi-public school experience, I found no difficulty in adapting to service life, and when asked what interested me, I opted for the wireless. After 9 months' training, most of it at Compton Bassett in Wiltshire, I passed out as a fully fledged junior technician wireless fitter. 2768410. Beerling JW, that was me, ready to fix radios anywhere in the world. I might have been posted to Christmas Island where the atomic tests were being held, or Malaya, or Kenya, or Cyprus, but in fact drew the hottest straw, Aden. This was not all bad, for had I not been posted there I probably wouldn't have joined the BBC, because in Aden there was a radio station set up by the Royal Air Force with financial support from British Petroleum. It was the Aden Forces Broadcasting Association, AFBA. It broadcast for the entertainment and information of the oil workers' families, of course, and the troops stationed there. This was way before British Forces Broadcasting took it over, and there were only 2 permanent staff, an admin clerk and a station engineer. All of the other broadcasting staff were volunteers. Well, I was told one should never volunteer for anything in the forces, but when my commanding officer asked, "Would you like the job of station engineer?" I nearly bit his hand off. Although I had no idea what was entailed, it was explained to me that apart from maintenance of the equipment, I was expected to get up at 05:30 every day to present the early morning record show until 8 o'clock, when we'd relay the general overseas service of the BBC until shutdown at 8:30. AFBA would then reopen at 5 o'clock in the evening. This arrangement was due to the excessive daytime heat, which meant the working day for the troops was from 7 till 1. My goodness, did we have fun. There was only one other permanent member of staff, a clerk librarian, a chap called Eddie Stafford. Eddie and I lived in a one-room flat over the studio, and I learned fast. Although I hadn't done any broadcast DJ work as such, I listened to the radio all my life and I thought I was another Barry Aldis. I was probably very cocky and, like many DJs I know, in love with myself. This could be what led to a mysterious bust-up with the admin man, Eddie Stafford. Eddie was a regular airman, that's to say he was in for many years and had been posted for at least 2 years in Aden. This led to his becoming a little stir-crazy. At least that's the only explanation I have for his strange behaviour, when one day he suddenly decided he would no longer speak to me. This was something of a problem when it came to working together on the early show, as I could speak to him, but he would only answer by telling any third party who was present, "Tell Beerling to go and do X, Y and Z." I never did find out what was behind it. He eventually went home to Manchester. If you're listening to this, Eddie, perhaps it's time we kissed and made up after all this time. By now, I knew broadcasting was what I wanted to do. That was going to be my life, and when I returned to the UK on the 21st of January 1957, I sent off my application to the BBC for the post of probationary technical operator, and after answering a few simple questions on Ohm's law and my RAF experience, I was offered a post as a technical operator, a TO. Monday, October the 28th, 1957, I reported to Broadcasting House, not realising this would be my workplace for the next 36 years. In those days, the Russians were preparing to put a dog in orbit in space, and in the Daily Sketch for October the 28th there was a report of a speech given by the BBC's Director General, Sir Ian Jacob. This was to mark the 21st birthday of the television service. In it he made a most remarkable claim. British television viewers will one day be able to watch live events all over the world as they are actually happening. Can you imagine that? As technical operators, TOs, we were part of the engineering division of the BBC. We monitored circuits in the London control room in the bowels of Broadcasting House, and as such the closest we came to programme making was to operate the continuity studios. This was where the resident duty announcer would introduce programmes. The duty TO would start the next show by switching on the flicks and a steady red light to warn the studio it was about to go live. The red light, of course, showed the studio was on air. What power! One day I remember being allowed, under supervision of course, to start the playback of the recording of Mrs. Dale's diary. Such was the nervous tension that I had to run to the toilet to relieve myself, only to be told by a giggling lady that I was doing so in the ladies, not the gents. I didn't see a future for myself as a member of BBC Engineering. How could I move on? I found out the job I really wanted was called in BBC language an SM. No, not a sex maniac, although there are those who would say the title might have been appropriate, but it was actually the title Studio Manager. At the lowest level, these people rattled the teacups on Mrs. Dale's diary, or made the coconut shells sound like horses' hooves. Other studio managers played the records of sound effects or spun in discs on record programmes, and as they became more experienced, they did the actual sound mixing. How could I get a job doing this? I did some research. All jobs in the BBC at that time were advertised internally, and it appeared that all studio managers were required to be in possession of a university degree. This was an area where I was distinctly lacking. 2 years in the RAF College of Life wouldn't count for much. One couldn't possibly be arty, darling, unless one had been to uni. Anyway, undaunted, I applied. Fate intervened again, as someone had enough nous to realise that we could do it without a degree, and we were accepted for transfer into the world of programme operations. We were budding SMs. Chapter 4. The Radio 1 Egg is Laid. I started a new life as a studio manager and a new life as a husband. By now I'd married Carol, a BBC secretary, but the BBC was no respecter of young love. Soon after the honeymoon I was dragged away from my bride and sent to the front line for 3 months. Actually, it was to the BBC Training School for Studio Managers at Wood Norton in the Vale of Evesham, a wonderful old country mansion where the BBC had sited its emergency broadcasting centre during the war. After the war it was turned into the home of BBC Engineering Training, and there we were taught all our broadcasting skills. After some initial work on the overseas service, I was transferred to the General Programme Operations section at Broadcasting House, or BH as it was known. In BH there were numerous well-qualified studio managers who specialised in specific areas, such as serious music, drama, popular music and features, while the general programme operations studio managers did everything else. That was children's programmes, school broadcasting, news and current affairs, sport, gramophone programmes and anything else of a non-specialist nature. Not outside broadcasts, though, which were in those days still very much part of the engineering division. Those people jealously guarded their empire. There were shades of the forces in this. "You horrible little studio manager, you not got any engineering know-how, so get your dirty little non-technical hands off the knobs on that highly technical OB8 mixer." No studio managers were allowed to operate outside broadcasting, that's OB equipment. From day one I loved it in domestic radio, and although in the earliest days I was only allowed to make sound effects and play in discs, I soon earned a reputation as an enthusiast, and producers started to request me to work on their specific productions. I learnt how to put out the news, the home service news that is, from our studios 3F and 3G in Egton House. That was the home of the BBC Radio newsroom. I was regularly working with such household names as Andrew Timothy, John Snagg, Alvar Liddell and Wallace Greenslade. He was also famous, of course, as the announcer on the Goon shows. We worked on Radio Newsreel, the evening half-hour roundup introduced by the stirring signature tune Imperial Echoes. Now, only in an organisation like the BBC could there be a gramophone department, Grams. This was the department whose sole job was to make every programme that used commercial records as the core of its content. It was provided over by a fearsome lady, Anna Instone, who was one of the few women who had made it to a senior position within the BBC. She was to be a major player in my career later, but in the early days my familiarity with her department came as a result of spinning in the discs on the popular programmes of the day. I used to work on Housewife's Choice and Midday Spin, as well as Pete Murray's Pete's Party, David Jacobs' Pick of the Pops, and Alan Dell's Date with a Disc. DJs in those days had it easy. They didn't spin their own records, far from it, nor did they ad-lib. Everything was scripted and pre-timed, and on the day of the broadcast, the team would assemble for a complete full-time rehearsal. The team for a simple broadcast would consist of a producer, a studio manager to mix the sound, an assistant studio manager to play in the discs, and the DJ who sat in another glass-walled box where he, or occasionally she, would read the script. Housewife's Choice was a hugely popular programme on which I regularly worked. The show went out from 9 a.m. till 9:55, Monday to Friday on the light programme. Perhaps due to the influence of Anna Instone, there were 5 lady producers in Gramophone Department, and 3 of them worked on Housewife's Choice: Isabel Burdett, Pat Osborne and Esther Farmer. The process of producing Housewife's Choice was a very long-winded one. The producer responsible for a particular week would sort through literally thousands of postcards to find those that were requesting a balanced programme of music, pop, light classics, songs from the shows, male vocals, female vocals, and so on. The chosen celebrity would then be sent off home to write out a script in longhand with all his cards, and this would then be typed and turned into a broadcast script complete with the durations of the records. On the day of the broadcast, the team will assemble at 7 a.m. and do a full timed rehearsal, and then while the team enjoyed a continental breakfast, adjustments would be made to the durations of the music tracks, and the script would be scrutinised and produced as if each link were a little talk. Rehearsal over, we'd go on the air at 9 a.m. and continue until 9:55, when everything stopped for a story, a hymn and a prayer. And that would be it for another day. Labour-intensive or what? Well, I was quite a pretty boy, and Gilbert Harding took a shine to me, though not to producer Esther Farmer, because she was prone to knit in the cubicle. And at the end of each show, Gilbert would take his leave with a warm farewell. "Very nice to have you with us again, young man," to me, and a dismissive "Good day to you, ma'am," to Esther. Derek McCulloch, Uncle Mac, and the voice of Larry the Lamb from Children's Hour was another curmudgeonly old man. But bearing in mind his considerable war wounds, it was perhaps not surprising if he bleated from time to time. He presented Children's Choice on Saturday mornings in the same time slot as Housewife's Choice, though here the mixture was less pop and more Nellie the Elephant and Sparky's Magic Piano. Pat Osborne, one of the lady producers I referred to earlier, nearly caught me in an embarrassing situation which could have resulted in my early departure from the BBC. When I had been in Aden, one of my colleagues at the Aden Forces Broadcasting Association was Roger Clifford. On his discharge, Roger had taken a job with Pi Records, where one of his responsibilities was the production of the Pi Records programmes for Radio Luxembourg. When Roger knew I was working as an SM and spinning discs for the BBC, he offered me a chance to do a little moonlighting for Pi. I was hard up, finding it hard to manage on my £750 a year, so I accepted, provided it could be done discreetly, because I was supposed to be on an exclusive contract. I had to fiddle my shifts as a studio manager so that I was free every Thursday morning, and that worked pretty well, and I gained my first experience of commercial broadcasting. One Thursday we were happily recording in IBC studios there just across the road from the BBC when the manager said he'd invited in someone from the BBC to see how Luxembourg shows were made. It was Housewife's Choice producer Pat Osborne. She was on her way up the stairs to our studio. What followed was like a scene from a Brian Rix farce as I dived into the nearest broom cupboard while Pat stood outside asking awkward questions of Alan Freeman about who played the records. She left after a while, and to this day I don't think anyone knows it was me what done it. On Saturday nights, David Jacobs was always a great favourite. He was presenting Jukebox Jury on BBC television every Saturday evening. Most Saturday evenings he would invite one of the celebrities who'd been appearing earlier to come to the radio studio to see him present his show. I remember one evening Henrietta Tiarks, the Marquess of Tavistock as she was then, now the Dowager Duchess of Bedford. She came in and she taught me how to do the twist as I spun in the record by Chubby Checker. Producer Derek Chinnery looked on in mild amusement. Gramophone Department was also responsible for the production of one of the most popular programmes in the country, the light programmes Two-Way Family Favourites on Sunday lunchtime. This was such a senior programme that it was regularly produced by the assistant head of the department, Dougie Lawrence. It was here I met with the late Gene Metcalf, while on the other end of the line in Germany was Bill Crozier. In my early days I spun the discs for Gene and Bill, and then, as I gained experience, I took over as the panel operator where I mixed the show. This was always a great pleasure, and one I look forward to, as Gene was a wonderfully warm person who made everyone feel better for having worked with her. I realised quite early on that the very best broadcasters are those whose real personality is reflected in their broadcasting one. Gene was a living example of this. Pete Murray was another fun personality with whom I worked regularly. Pete's party went out late on Saturday nights. In addition to playing great music by all the top artists of the day, Pete would generally include a live interview. Because of the late transmission time, we could attract the stars after they had finished their theatre performances. On Pete's party, among the many stars I met, was Sammy Davis Jr., who was just as ebullient in person as he was on film and stage, Tony Bennett, Jack Jones and Judy Garland. If I'd kept an autograph book it would be priceless, but sadly I didn't. I figured I could learn a lot by sitting in on those productions. I made friends with John Hooper, who produced the Ted Heath Show. This gave me a regular chance to see and hear my favourite band and learn about music balancing from the top music SM who always did the Ted Heath sessions, Freddie Harris. By 1963 I'd been in the BBC for 5 years and gained considerable experience in just about all the general areas of domestic broadcasting. I enjoyed the work as a studio manager, but increasingly I found myself more and more involved with the Gramophone Department productions, where I felt totally at home with the music. I worked frequently with producers Derek Chinnery and Teddy Warwick, both of whom became friends, and whose programmes I enjoyed as they were in the mainstream popular output. It was Teddy who suggested that I ought to consider myself a suitable candidate for a production post in their department. I applied, was successful, and in 1963 it was goodbye studio managing, hello production in the Gramophone Department under my new boss, Anna Instone, and her assistant head, my old colleague from Two-Way Family Favourites, Dougie Lawrence. 1963 and 4 were fabulous years to be involved in popular music. The Beatles were at their height. There was Mersey beat music everywhere, and I can still remember the excitement we felt, even we hardened old music professionals, at getting our hands on a new single by the Beatles. In the shops there were Beatle wigs, shirts, sweaters and jackets. Millions of schoolboys, despite school regulations to the contrary, were trying to grow their hair to Beatle length, and swinging England was undergoing its birth pangs. While all this was going on, I was producing a range of different record programmes with many celebrity presenters. One was Canadian Murray Cash, husband of Libby Morris. Murray and I did a regular country music series which gave me the chance to indulge my passion for that genre of music. Rolf Harris, Jim Dale and Val Doonican all did a show called Playtime, aimed at the younger listeners. Val and I also shared an enthusiasm for country music, so much so that Val asked me to come to the studio when he recorded his big hit Walk Tall. We spent hours trying to get the intimate vocal sound used by Jim Reeves, and the record did very well. On Housewife's Choice and other request programmes, record pluggers' postcards could be a pain. Some would resort to sending in dummy requests for specific records they were working on, and soon we became pretty adept at spotting the phony cards. It would be pretty obvious when one received several cards all bearing the same postcard requesting the latest record by a particular act. There were a few laughs to be had from translating what the listeners wanted in their various cards. A request for Ivor Maria was Ave Maria, Victor Moan meant Victor Moan, Arabella Fonte meant Harry Belafonte, and the requests were often written on unusual objects to catch the eye of the producer. In my time I had them on sailors' hats, knickers, silk scarves, and even coconuts. Pick of the Pops was one of the Light programme's really long-running popular music shows. In my early days as a studio manager, Alan Freeman was the lively young Australian presenter of the show. I'd played disc for him when Derek Chinnery was the producer, and now I was in that role. I can truly say life was wonderful at this time. I had a young daughter, Julie. We had moved to a new home in Kent, and I was doing the job I always wanted, surrounded by non-stop music. One day I was in my office and I had a visitor fresh from the pirate radio station Radio Caroline. His name, Simon D. I was surprised to see him, as he was making a big name for himself on the North Sea, but government pressure on the pirates was building, and he'd seen the writing on the wall. After a few introductory greetings, he came out with it. How would I go about getting a job in the BBC? I took him over the road to the Dover Castle pub for a pint and a chat, and I agreed to push his name forward as a possible midday spin presenter. He was a big success on this, and within a few months he was looking for an even bigger role. Soon after this happened, I was seconded to Aeolian Hall in New Bond Street, where the popular music department, our big rivals, lived. This unit had grown out of Light Entertainment and was set up to manage a range of music recorded in our own studios, as well as the newly emerging composite programmes made up of a mixture of both studio sessions and commercial discs. There was the root of a difficulty here, which was to persist into the days when Radio 1 was set up. The producers in popular music felt they were more creative than Graham's producers, and that their skills were not recognised. My friend Bernie Andrews, who had joined the BBC on the same day as me, was by now a producer in popular music, and eventually he took over Saturday Club. Bernie had a close relationship with the Beatles and the Stones and made a name for himself through the excellent quality of his BBC studio recording sessions, in which he took enormous pride. His great attention to detail meant that he could get near commercial studio quality. Consequently, artists trusted him and were willing to come into BBC studios to make unique recordings, which, incidentally, the BBC exploited years later, licensing them for issue as commercial records. I too was at last in a position to book bands and performers to record sessions for inclusion in my own programme. This was called Music to Midnight. I could book any music performers I wanted. "Can I book Ted Heath?" I asked my executive producer, Jeff Owen. "Yes, as long as you book Eric Winston's band on opposite weeks," was the reply. I was never sure about the reason for this, but assumed Eric must have been a friend of Jeff's, so I was away. What a thrill to have my idol Ted Heath working for me. I could go through the arrangement books, pick the tunes I wanted the band to record, and then record the sessions in our own studios. Vernon Lawrence, Dougie's son, had by then replaced Freddie Harris as the studio manager balancing the band, and we had a ball. Music to Midnight ran for quite a while, until I devised something new for the late evening, the Simon D Show. This was very much like a radio version of the televised Parkinson Show, but with more music. It was a live show from Studio S1 in the basement of Broadcasting House. Ironically, by this time the studio now occupied the very space where I'd first worked in the control room when I started in the BBC. We had a resident group who would accompany any guest singers and take the mickey out of Simon while he attempted to interview the star guests. In October 1966, my boss Mark White called me to the office. By this time Dougie Lawrence had retired as assistant head of the department, and Mark had replaced him. Mark introduced me to a young Irish presenter who he proposed to employ on Midday Spin. We eyed each other up. He looked friendly enough, and Mark asked me to produce his first series, and that's how Terry Wogan came to join the BBC. In those days, Terry was on the staff of Radio Telefís Éireann, RTE, and although his employers were happy to have him present an additional programme for the BBC in London, they were unable to guarantee sufficient time off for Terry to come over to present the show. So every fourth week I would travel over to Dublin to stay with Terry and his wife Helen so that we could produce the show from the RTE studios, which were in the old post office building in O'Connell Street. Terry is another natural and genuine broadcaster, and you can imagine we had a lot of laughs each week. One time when I went over there was a strike by Ireland's farmers, and the whole city was besieged with tractors. It was in the depth of winter, a very cold night, and we toured the bars of that fair city in search of fun. To keep warm we had to drink large quantities of the black stuff, followed by Jameson chasers. The evening finished, as I remember, with Terry and I playing snooker against a team of striking farmers, though I can't say who won. Terry and Helen were wonderful hosts, and we certainly weren't feeling fine when we assembled for the broadcast next day. Who would have thought that by 2005 he would become Sir Terry O'Wogan? I was now well established in the gramophone department and had considerable production experience, so I was in a position to put up one-off ideas of my own, rather than sitting back to wait to be allocated specific programmes. I heard Jim Reeves was coming to London on a visit and that he would be performing at the American Officers Club in the Bayswater Road. Pat Campbell was the plugger for RCA, and he cooperated in helping me put together a Jim Reeves special for the Light programme. In this, Jim talked very frankly about his songs, and I was glad to have the opportunity to meet and record this singer who was one of my idols. As the recording had gone so well, Pat offered to take us next evening to the club in Bayswater, where Jim would be doing a special live show. Gentleman Jim was the tag attached to Jim Reeves, but based on our experience that evening it was a far from accurate description. The audience was made up of both black and white officers who'd been drinking for a while before Jim came on stage. When he did start, there was a little good-natured barracking from some of the black guys in the audience who were a little tired of waiting. Jim's trademark on stage was a bright red jacket, but I didn't appreciate that he was a real redneck. He totally lost it when the heckling started, and not only started to racially abuse those who had upset him, but he was all set to jump into the audience and take on the offenders. He was restrained, order was restored, and Jim completed his set, but it left a sour taste in my mouth, and as I left I reflected that few idols live up to one's expectations. Probably better to worship them from afar. Jim Reeves, he'd have to go. Out there in the English Channel, life was changing. In March 1967, the Torrey Canyon oil tanker went aground off the Scilly Isles, spilling 100,000 gallons of crude oil, polluting that end of the English Channel. Up at the other end, off Kent and Essex, the so-called pirate stations were polluting the airwaves with their illegal broadcasts. Radio Caroline had been the first to be heard on the air on Easter Sunday 1965. The station was named after President Kennedy's daughter, Caroline. She had set a style which was soon copied by others broadcasting from ships and forts in the Thames estuary and off the west coast of Scotland. They paid no copyright fees, had no limitations on needle time which they didn't pay for, and had no authorised frequencies on which to broadcast. Despite all this, they were attracting huge audiences, and their freewheeling style was very different from our formalised and scripted offerings. Listening to all this, I realised things had to change at the BBC if we were to retain any credibility with younger listeners. On a pirate station, there were no studio managers playing in discs or mixing the sound. Everything was done by the DJ. He operated his own microphones, played in his own records, pre-recorded sketches and jingles. All this was done at a custom-built desk where everything was within arm's reach. In America they had been doing it this way for years, but to Europeans it was revolutionary. On Saturdays I was producing a fast-moving pop show called Where It's At. One of the biggest scoops we had was in May when we aired an exclusive showcase on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There had already been a huge row with Dick James Publishing Company and Parlophone the record company because Radio London, which was a pirate operator, had aired some tracks the week before. That was before we, the official broadcasters, had even been given a copy. We made up for it with this special, which was part of an extended Where It's At. Kenny Everett had always been very close to John Lennon, so was able to obtain a long interview with John and the other Beatles in EMI's Abbey Road studios, where they talked about each track in detail. It was one of those wonderful specials that was still being assembled by Kenny and producer Jeff Hayden as we went on the air at 4 o'clock. Even in the high echelons of the BBC, where I don't suppose there were many pirate radio listeners, there was a realisation that listening habits of the country were changing. "By golly, you chaps, I suppose we ought to think about doing something to meet the challenge from this bunch of Jolly Rogers." During the year 1966, the BBC had undertaken a soul-searching exercise to decide what sort of domestic broadcasting service would be appropriate for the 1970s. They came up with a report, the gist of which was that we should scrap the home, light and third programmes and replace them with generically themed services. In other words, we would establish BBC National Network radios 1, 2, 3 and 4, as well as 20 English BBC local stations to complement the regional services in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In January 1967, the planning for Radio 1 started. I don't know whether it was economics or an indication of our lack of importance, but instead of separate controllers for the two networks, we were to work under a joint one. In February 1967, the new controller for both Radios 1 and 2 was appointed. His name, Robin Scott. Nicknamed the White Tornado due to his white hair and tremendous enthusiasm, he soon endeared himself to us all. Robin had once written a huge hit song for Ruby Murray, Softly Softly, and followed this with a career in the BBC, where he had a reputation as something of a jazz expert. He had been the BBC's Paris representative and had enjoyed a distinguished career in Eurovision television. He soon earned our respect and was quite one of the boys. Prior to Robin's arrival under the old BBC, none of us had ever met a controller. They were remote figures from another BBC planet. Robin as controller had many problems. For a start, his total budget was only £200,000 more than was currently being spent on the existing light programme. With this he had to set up 2 networks. Then there were the limitations on needle time, that's the number of commercial records we could play. And for the first time in history of the BBC, these new imported disc jockeys were going to broadcast without a script, and with no control over what they might say. Imagine the internal horror. Only BBC announcers had previously been given the freedom of the microphone, and here was Robin about to put on 2 networks with some broadcasters who had only ever worked on pirate stations. I don't know what internal battles Robin had to fight to get agreement to this, but I've guessed the conversation went something like, "Well, all right, Scotty, if you must do it, but we'll have your guts for garters if it all goes tits up." Robin's faith in his DJs was justified, and for the first few weeks there weren't any problems caused by DJ ad-libs. On the technical and union front, though, there were all kinds of problems. Robin was quick to appreciate the talents of Kenny Everett, and I acted as a go-between, introducing them. Kenny explained the requirement for self-op studios, that is, studios for the DJs where they could operate all the equipment for themselves. Imagine the union attitude to this change of practice. The only place in the BBC where this could happen at the time was in the continuity studios. This was where the linking announcers maintained the programme chain. In the rare event of a breakdown, these announcers could play an emergency fill-up disc. So some continuities were modified for the proposed new networks, and other brand new ones were specially built. To this day, DJs still talk about broadcasting from the cons. Because of a lack of funds and resources, many of the programmes had to go out on both Radio 1 and 2 simultaneously, so it was going to be impossible to create a totally separate identity. Kenny's needs too were more special. Over and above the cons, he needed access to a wireless workshop where he could indulge his brand of creativity. I managed to find Kenny a room on the 3rd floor of Radio 1's building, which was empty, and it was duly equipped, and he was happy as a pig in the proverbial, though there were BBC engineers who didn't approve of a non-engineer making his own recordings. Kenny had a lot of influence in another direction, jingles. I set up a lunch with Robin with Kenny at Verrey's, that's a restaurant near Oxford Circus, frequented by many show business people, including impresario Harold Davidson, Eric and Ernie's agent Billy Marsh, and Michael Grade. And as I sat there star-spotting, Kenny told Robin the facts of life as they related to jingle identifications. On Pirate Radio London, the jingles had been made in America by Promotions and Merchandisers, PAMS of Dallas. If we wanted Radio 1 to sound anything like Big L, as Radio London was known, then we should ask PAMS to produce a suitable ident package for us. Bill Meeks was the owner of PAMS, and he came to London soon after on August the 3rd to discuss our needs, and next day I arranged for him to meet Derek Chinnery and Robin Scott. Bill explained that his jingles were mostly syndicated cuts, that is, using a common instrumental backing track over which his singers could sing specific messages. We opted for some originals and some of the Big L jingles to be resung so that they would be recognisable to our listeners. All these became synonymous with the early days of Radio 1. What had been "You're a Winner" with Wonderful Radio London became "You're a Winner with Wonderful Radio 1, along with Radio 1 is Wonderful," to the tune of London Bridge is Falling Down. We didn't exactly shout about our plans, as there would have been an outcry from the Musicians' Union and Equity, the Actors' Union. Why wouldn't we use British musicians and singers? The truth was there was no company in the UK which could supply the unique sound that PAMS created, and in any case the restrictive nature of our agreements would have meant that every time a jingle was played we would have had to make out a music reporting form to pay the copyright holders and pay the performers a repeat fee. Dallas, on the other hand, was a right-to-work state, where the owner of the jingle company could do a one-off buyout of all rights in the performance and sell those broadcasting rights to the purchaser. And that's why for the next 20 years BBC Radio 1 and 2 continued to buy from various jingle companies in America. Robin decided that in addition to jingle IDs we needed a theme or signature tune for Radio 1, and for that we definitely went British. George Martin, who had risen to a position of some eminence through his production of the Beatles, was approached, and in due course delivered the magnificent Theme 1, which would launch us onto the 247 airwaves. In early September, the lineup of DJs for Radio 1 had been announced, and the obligatory photos were taken on the steps of All Souls Church next door to Broadcasting House. There was much jostling for prime positions, and much larking about at the expense of the huge gang of press photographers who turned out to record the event. The new DJs like Tony Blackburn, Kenny Everett, Keith Skews, Mike Lennox, Pete Brady, John Peel, Duncan Johnson, Ed Stewpot Stewart, Mike Raven, Stuart Henry, Emperor Roscoe, and Pete Drummond dressed in their very casual clothes, and they blended with the straights like Pete Murray, Alan Freeman, Jimmy Young, David Jacobs, Terry Wogan, and Don Moss. The only totally new boy was a former studio manager, David Ryder. It looked like a pretty happy ship. Oh no, that's the wrong word, sorry, happy radio station. Before we could put Radio 1 on the air, we producers were rushing about making pilot programmes in the new style. I was to produce the opening programme, The Daily Breakfast Show with Tony Blackburn, as well as continuing with my Saturday afternoon Where It's At show. I already knew Tony since he'd come ashore from Radio London, and like me, he'd been a radio enthusiast since he was a child. Although educated at public school, Millfield, he left at 16 to start a career in show business, first as a musician and then a compere. In 1964, aged 21, he was the youngest DJ on the new pirate ship Radio Caroline, and 2 years later went over to Radio London. When he left there, it was for a legitimate career on shore, and he started presenting Midday Spin on the Light programme. Derek Chinnery, the head of the department, said, "Well, he spoke decent English, had a public school education, and would easily fit into the BBC way of doing things." A natural then for the new Radio 1. We were paired up. Tony was very easy to work with, was eager to please everyone, and like many performers, had a streak of insecurity, which meant he needed constant reassurance. Was that all right, do you think? What are the listening figures this week? Do you think they like me out there? What did the boss say about my last programme? He was also quite shy, preferring to work in the solitude of his studio without an audience. He was a good communicator who once again proved my maxim that the best broadcasters are those who act naturally. Tony Blackburn on air is just the same as Tony Blackburn off air. Take him or leave him, that's who he is. Tony had strong views on the music and format for the breakfast show. Lots of current hits, lots of oldies, the more Tamla Motown the better, and a few good new records. Not too much unfamiliar music. And as for the presentation, lots of identification for Tony Blackburn to ensure that he became as well known as the radio station. Time checks after every record, and lots of corny gags. Naturally, he and I argued about the music, as I was a country music fan, but we tried different combinations for the pilot programmes, and by opening day, I believe we had got it about right. We were set to launch. Chapter 5. Radio 1 is hatched. For Tony and me, that first breakfast show passed in a flash. I remember that classic piece of film where Tony is supposedly opening a network was actually recreated again after transmission. The TV crew were not happy with the first take. There wasn't room for them to get all the camera angles, and in that film clip you can't even see me. It looks as if the only person there, apart from Tony, was Robin Scott. People often ask why we chose Flowers in the Rain as an opener. It was simple. The record was number 2 in the charts that week, and it was a good up-tempo, catchy number, which Tony and I agreed would set the mood we wanted to create for breakfast time. Relations between us were pretty good, and in an interview for the Melody Maker, Tony said, "I have a freer hand with the BBC than I ever had with the Pirates. I'm lucky enough to have a producer who understands the new methods of working needed for this type of show." 23 records, and 1.5 hours later we were off the air. It had gone better than we could ever have hoped. No major problems or technical faults, and congratulations all round from Robin Scott. Tony handed over to Leslie Crowther for the children's request show Junior Choice. This was a hangover from the light programme, as was the next programme, Saturday Club. But to give Saturday Club a facelift, someone thought it a good idea to drop the ubiquitous Brian Matthew and replace him with another ex-pirate and ex-Forces broadcaster, Keith Skews. Keith had been a presenter in Kenya and later in Aden, so there was a natural affinity between us, and we are still good friends. Perhaps the biggest jolt to the ears of the listeners came at midday with the arrival of Emperor Roscoe, a.k.a. Mike Pasternak, the only Radio 1 DJ with a genuine American accent. Mike was the son of film producer Joe Pasternak, and he had received much of his education at schools in France and Switzerland. In the process, he'd become a pretty fluent French speaker. He learned his broadcasting skills on a US Navy aircraft carrier in the USS Coral Sea on their radio station KVCA. And then as a civilian, he'd worked with Radio Monte Carlo and later French Radio Luxembourg. In 1966 he went to sea again with Dave Lee Travis and Tony Blackburn on Radio Caroline. His gimmick was exploiting his French expertise to create a sort of franglais pop patois. He made a huge name for himself in France, delivering his speech in a sort of rhyming patter of franglais, and coupled this with a pretty wild and exciting music choice which made fascinating listening. Derek Chinnery had spotted his potential and rushed off to Paris to sign up the Emperor for Radio 1. It was certainly different, and John Dunn, who was reading the 12:30 news halfway through the programme, came out with the classic opening line, "And now here is the news in English." I came to know Roscoe pretty well over the years, as we shared a love of sea fishing. He liked nothing better than to escape from the din and smoke of clubs and discos where he earned his living and get out in the fresh air. We became very good friends, and eventually I wrote my first book with him, Emperor Roscoe's DJ Handbook. It's coming out shortly in an updated version as an e-book. If you can find a copy, you can read much more about Mike and his career. Incidentally, we always had news on the half hour at Radio 1 because every other broadcaster scheduled it on the hour. I think Robin Scott figured that if listeners to other radio stations got bored with news, we could always be playing music, which might be a more attractive proposition. His idea must have been a good one because Radio 1 still has its news on the half hour. Another voice on the Radio 1 airways was that of Duncan Johnson. When I had been producing Music to Midnight on the Light programme, I used to drive home after the show, and while driving through the Kent countryside, I would frequently tune into a DJ on Radio London with a very dark brown voice called Duncan Johnson. Duncan's style and intonation reminded me of Willis Conover, who I'd enjoyed in The Voice of America in my school days. One day in early 1967, several of us were having a drink in the Masons' Arms, a pub at Marble Arch, after a Pye Records reception, when one of the record pluggers, he was propping up the bar, said, "Haven't you always wanted to meet Duncan Johnson? Well, he's over there by the bar. I'll introduce you." And I was somewhat surprised to meet a tall young man with curly hair, who wasn't American but Canadian. So much for radio images. In my mind, I'd expected Duncan to be short, at least 50, balding and very mature. When Radio 1 started, Duncan presented a daily 5-minute quiz, Crack the Clue, as well as Tuesday's midday spin. For all of us involved in the opening day, it had been very exciting as the plans started to turn into reality. All in all, considering the limitations of money and needle time, it hadn't been a bad start. By now, 1967, my wife and I with a growing family had moved to a small village in the Kent countryside. The only snag was it was 44 miles from the BBC, and to get to the breakfast show in time to set up, I had to drag myself out of bed at 4 a.m. and drive to London. There were no trains that early. After 1 week of doing this, I was shattered. Much as I enjoyed working on the wireless, there were limits, and it was clear that Tony was more than competent to handle the actual transmission. Apart from grinning inanely at his jokes, there was little I could do to help once he'd gone on the air, and Tony preferred to be left alone for the actual broadcast. So, after a week, I opted to listen at home, then commuted by train to meet Tony for a post-transmission analysis and to compile the next day's programme. It seemed a sensible division of responsibilities. For much of the regular daytime output, shows like Jimmy Young's in the morning and Pete Brady in the afternoon, we relied on stripped programming. Now, that's got nothing to do with naked presenters, it's mass-production radio. It was a concept which had grown out of the popular music department in 1965. In earlier days, each producer responsible for 2 hours of airtime would listen to a large selection of records for possible inclusion, record the studio sessions, and write out the running order in longhand. It was back to the old long-winded BBC traditions. The secretaries had to add all the reporting details to make a running order, and then a programme as broadcast, a PSB report. To do 5 of these 2-hour shows took an awful lot of individual administration and time. Someone suggested that the relevant details of all potential music items, whether discs or pre-recorded studio sessions, could be typed once only onto cardboard slips. These could then be inserted into special pre-formed pages to make up each day's programme. They could then be photocopied for distribution and the slips shuffled as required each day. By putting our toe into the assembly line approach, we were effectively making the first mass-produced radio. This method of working gave producers time to do more rewarding tasks, devising interesting features, booking guests, and so on. In terms of efficiency, it was quite a step forward. 7 producers looked after 78 hours of programming a week. The disadvantage was that it could make producers lazy. If we'd had the technology available, we could have done the same thing with the aid of a simple computer program. But in 1967 in the BBC, they were still using the abacus to count the payroll. Because we were not able to afford to play records all day, on most weekday programmes we broadcast an hour-long programme of live music on both Radio 1 and 2 networks. These shows consisted of somewhat self-conscious copies of the current hits covered by big bands and their resident singers. Johnny Howard and his band, Ray McVeigh, the Northern Dance Orchestra from Manchester, Bob Miller and the Millermen, and Joe Loss and his band. The boys and girls in these bands did their best, and in the average ballroom they would have sounded pretty good, but covers of the Beatles, the Hollies or Herman's Hermits were no substitute for the real thing. The producers did sometimes book studio guests, and on one show, to the amazement of the studio audience, Jimi Hendrix appeared live. Imagine the scene. In front of the smartly dressed saxophones and brass players of the big band, there was Jimmy in full hippie regalia, picking away with his teeth at the melody of Hey Joe. Certainly a sight to get the regular old ladies sitting in the front row excited enough to rattle their knitting needles. Most of these shows were embellished by having a so-called hip presenter, either another ex-pirate DJ or an extrovert musician. Denny Piercy, for example, was a former drummer who presented Bob Miller's Parade of the Pops. One of the lunchtime producers was Don George. Don was known in Radio 1 as a legend in his own lunchtime due to his penchant for enjoying regular plugging lunches. He'd done some singing, and one day he decided to introduce the Joe Loss Show himself because the regular presenter had failed to show up. Don, as always a frustrated performer, did his best, but being possessed of a broad West Country accent, you can imagine the result. It sounded as if Adge Cutler or one of his Wurzels had taken over the show. Management was not amused. Despite Don's efforts, some presenters with this big band background went on to become very big. The late Ray Moore, for instance, followed staff announcer Roger Moffat as compere of the Northern Dance Orchestra shows, the NDO from Manchester. When Ray became a major Radio 2 personality, Dave Lee Travis took over his slot and later moved to London, where he ate far too much breakfast cereal and became the hairy cornflake. There was no complete separation of the two networks in those days, so both had problems establishing a regular identity. Radio 1 only broadcast as a separate station for 53 hours a week, and it took 14 years until 1981 before we were separated from Radio 2 on weekdays. In those weekday evenings in 1967, from 7:30 to 10 on 247 metres, listeners heard Radio 2 programmes. Instead of pop music of any kind, for 2.5 hours they heard what sounded remarkably like the former Light programme, panel games, comedies, and all sorts of music, including Humphrey Lyttelton and Peter Clayton's Jazz Club. At 10 o'clock it went the other way, with Radio 2 listeners taking the Radio 1 show, Late Night Extra. On Sundays, two-way family favourites also went out on both stations, but at least there were some current hits included here, and Michael Aspel as the London anchor gave it some more credibility. In the early days, Robin Scott had a difficult job to do because of the limited budget. He was expected to meet the ambitions of the regular Light programme patrons as well as those frustrated pirate listeners. Radio 1 was supposed to be a national network, but we were allocated the old Light programme transmitters on 247 metres in the medium wave. This covered most of the UK during daytime, but after dark there were changes in the ionosphere which resulted in other stations in Europe, notably one in Albania on 247 metres, coming in loudly and interfering with the UK's Radio 1. This made it terribly difficult to hear in some parts of the country, and it was estimated that only 30% of the population could actually hear 247 after dark. Radios 2, 3 and 4 each had a dedicated VHF FM broadcasting transmission chain covering most of the country. This meant they could be heard in crystal clear quality in stereo. Only on Saturday afternoons and weekday evenings, when Radio 2 relayed Radio 1, could our listeners hear us that way, and this situation lasted for years. When he was controller, Derek Chinnery, and then I fought long and hard to rectify that situation, and I suspect it took so long to secure the funding for a VHF network because those people at the very top secretly expected a Radio 1 to be a 5-minute wonder, well, maybe a 5-year one. Although it had more listeners than all the other networks, I'm sure they hoped it would eventually go away. There were certainly those who considered that as a public service broadcaster, the BBC had no business being involved in the ephemeral world of popular music with ex-pirate DJs. While I was producing The Breakfast Show, my pal Bernie Andrews was equally busy on a newish programme, Top Gear. It went out on Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5 and as such was the longest show on the new network. This was not simple pop, but a mixture of BBC recording sessions and records by the more experimental musicians and groups of the day. As Bernie put it in an interview at the time, we use groups that aren't all that acceptable or easy to listen to. By and large, our material is not suitable for any other programme because it needs listening to. He was establishing a trend that would years later become the model for Radio 1 when it sought to distinguish itself from the commercial opposition. It did this by its dedication to the development and support of the best British new music, with programmes that were designed to be listened to rather than simply heard as background music. Top Gear had actually started on the Light programme in 1964. Brian Matthew had been the original presenter, but the programme came off after a year because it was a bit too advanced for the Light programme. It was regurgitated at the request of Robin Scott for Radio 1. To present his new series, Bernie chose two very different DJs, John Peel and Pete Drummond. They were both ex-pirates, but John had made his name for himself on Radio London with his programme The Perfumed Garden. On that programme he assumed the role of champion of all uncommercial and experimental music. After the first programme, Bernie was called up by the management, who said they thought Peel was awful. "We don't like his dreary, boring voice. He sounds like he's on drugs," which he never was, "so don't ever use him again." Bernie felt so strongly that he told them he'd already contracted John for 8 weeks. Slap wrist for Bernie, but he carried on with Peel, supported by a second DJ, and gradually the second DJ disappeared, and after a few months management was won over, and John Peel became the sole presenter of Top Gear. John looked the part with his shoulder-length hair, a straggly beard and the hippie clothes to match, and this uncompromising approach was to set the pattern for John's BBC career, which was built on his reputation for spotting new musical trends and sticking with them, regardless of what management or the listeners thought. There's an interesting postscript to that Top Gear story, because Bernie was putting in so much time in the studio polishing his sessions. There was a natural resentment from other producers who had to do more than one programme a week. They weren't allowed to spend as much time as Bernie achieving these excellent sounds. By 1969 this bad feeling had built up, and the bosses, wishing to keep the peace, allocated Bernie a few routine programmes to do in addition to Top Gear. Bernie resented the fact that this would mean he had less time to spend on his sessions, and never the most tactful of people told management so. As a consequence, he was taken off Top Gear, and it was allocated to a new producer, one who was to work with John Peel for the rest of his life. That was John Waters. Alan Fluff Freeman was another lifer who was there at the beginning and who sadly died in 2006. In the new schedule he presented Pick of the Pops every Sunday afternoon following John Peel. His well-known signature tune, At the Sign of the Swinging Cymbal, became synonymous with almost any kind of chart countdown. Fluff, with his "All right, stay bright," became almost as big a star as Tony Blackburn. Fluff's show was hard to sell and very slick. It celebrated all the latest chart hits and couldn't have provided a bigger contrast to the music of Top Gear, which it followed. Robin Scott's programming schedule was certainly an eclectic one. Maybe it was forced on him by financial restraints, but he didn't follow the contemporary approach of gently leading the listeners from one programme to the next by offering some similarities in content and style. Robin still operated on the public service tradition, offering the listener a wide range of different programmes from which to choose. All this talk of DJs, or turns as Simon Bates christened them, set me thinking about this genre. I've often wondered what sort of person it is who wants to sit in a room on his or her own for 2 or 3 hours day after day, talking to the microphone and trying to think of something interesting to say between records. You try it for 35 or more speech links a day, 5 days a week, and you'll see what I mean. You have to have a very big ego to imagine that anyone is interested in what you have to say. Who cares what I think? But if they can't talk about themselves, many of the DJs are lost for words. I used to preach, if you can't think of anything interesting, entertaining or informative to say, shut up and play the music. In an effort to cut down unnecessary superfluous chit-chat, I once put up a slogan in the studio, one thought, one link. Some bright spark wrote graffiti next to it saying, you'll be lucky. If it was a technical operator who wrote it, I guess he meant most DJs didn't have one original thought for each link. But if it was a DJ who wrote it, then it was a rejection of my implied limitation on their freedom to chatter on. I don't suppose I'll ever know who the culprit was. In November 1967, after Radio 1 had been running for a couple of months, I was sent for by Mark White, the then head of Radio 1, and the newly promoted Derek Chinnery. They told me that my programme, Where It's At, would be taken off shortly as they needed the needle time for Kenny Everett, who was going to be given a Sunday morning show. This was difficult for me because Kenny was a good friend and I wanted him to have his own show. He deserved it. Where It's At, though, had been voted the second most popular BBC radio show in a recent Melody Maker poll, so I was not very happy. I believe Derek and Mark should have taken the needle time from elsewhere and left my programme alone. I got over it, and not long after my mind was on other things, as some students kidnapped my breakfast star, Tony Blackburn, on his way to the studio. Would they keep him locked up in isolation like Terry Waite for years? Was this plot instigated by John Peel? No, it turned out to be the work of a bunch of students from Surrey University who, as part of their Rag Week activities, decided to grab Tony as he came out of his London flat. Tony was annoyed rather than frightened. Apart from anything else, they drove him around in a van and forced him to listen to Radio 2 on the car radio. Where It's At came to its end, and Kenny Everett, with his butler Crisp, played by actor Brian Colvin, moved into the Sunday morning slot, where he was to consolidate his reputation as our most innovative DJ. Kenny was produced by Angela Bond, a lovely lady who mothered and encouraged him for many years. Before we knew it, jingle bells ran out and it was Christmas, and even BBC Television recognised us. In a seasonal broadcast from Billy Smart's circus, there were appearances by Tony Blackburn, Dave Cash, Keith Skews, Jimmy Young, and so on. Were they inspired by the clowns? Well, you may think that, but I couldn't possibly say. Even John Peel swallowed his reticence and turned up riding on the back of an elephant. We had survived our first 3 months. There had been a few DJ casualties along the way as Robin Scott weeded the Radio 1 garden. Sadly, my protégé, Duncan Johnson, got the chop from both his programmes. "Too old at 29, said one press report, and so did Micah Hearn and Rick Dane, and Pete Drummond was also off Top Gear. In listening terms, we had increased the original audience to the Light programme by 22%. That was the boast in our press release, but so we should have done. Most of the pirates, apart from Radio Caroline South, had by now closed down, and if you wanted popular music, there was only a choice of Radio Luxembourg in the evenings or Radio 1. When a radio station is up and running, it takes on a life of its own, and I always likened it to being on a very pleasant but non-stop treadmill. Tony Newley once wrote a musical, "Stop the World, I Want to Get Off," but with Radio 1 you couldn't. We all knew that whatever happened, the show must go on day after day and week after week. Consequently, it could be difficult for those of us standing inside to stand back and take a look at what was going on and what was happening. The DJs present their various types of show. The producers are intent on getting the next show ready, and the management are trying to hear everything to maintain quality. It was those of us laughingly called the suits who had to keep an eye on where it was going and plan ahead. Although I never discussed it with him, I reckon Robin must have had a sense of this as we went into 1968. He continued fine-tuning the schedule, making little changes such as promoting Ed Stewpot Stewart to be regular host of Junior Choice on Saturday mornings. Tony Blackburn came off Saturday breakfast and was trimmed back to 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. Another big star to shine, if that's the right word, was Jimmy Young. Doreen Davis, a very experienced producer, had taken Jimmy under her wing and produced his daily strip from 10 till 12. Doreen always had a good feel for what the audience wanted at that time of the day. She imagined Jimmy's typical listener as a young mum living at home in somewhere like Wigan, with 2 children under school age. In Doreen's mind, this listener would be trying to keep the children happy while doing the housework and listening to Jimmy's show. A couple of years later, Doreen took Jimmy's show on an outside broadcast, and where did she do it? The front room of a housewife's home in Wigan. She got the show right from the off, or off, as Jim would say, because within a year, over 7 million listeners were tuning in every day, and many continued to do so until 2003. Recipes were an integral part, and each day the speeded-up, gnomish voice of Raimondo would ask, "What's the recipe today, Jim?" The recipes were sent in by listeners and tested by Doreen on her long-suffering husband Derek to see if they were edible. Her philosophy in choosing which one to use was based on the principle that the ingredients had to be readily available and the dishes not too hard to prepare. It paid off because, despite the fact that Jimmy knew very little about cooking, such was the popularity of the slot that several books were published by the BBC, and they went on to make the bestseller lists. Perhaps it's a legacy of Jimmy that there's now a rash of cooking shows on the BBC. There was no stopping Jimmy. He developed a number of irritating catchphrases which involved using the initials of his regular sayings. BFN, bye for now. TTT, through till 12. And oft we jolly well go. A show which was to run for nearly 30 more years and eventually led to a knighthood for Jim. Not bad for the man from Laramie. Incidentally, when Jimmy sang that hit song, I always used to wonder at the line in which he sang, "Danger was this man's specialty." Was that PG Tips for the one-time crooner? Who knows? I was still busy. By now I'd come off the breakfast show and I was asked to exhume Disc Jockey Derby from its light programme Burial Chamber and put it on Tuesday lunchtimes to replace the long-running Pop In. Pop In had been Derek Chinnery's baby, where every week in the Paris studio before a live audience, Keith Fordyce had showcased and interviewed the current pop stars. It had been a great success, lots of screaming young girl fans mixed with the older Paris regular knitters who came into any free audience show to get out of the cold. But after a good many years it was becoming a little tired. Disc Jockey Derby, on the other hand, had Don Moss as its resident compere, and each week different DJs tried their skill at picking champion hits in a race to the top. As it was recorded in front of a studio audience, it needed a studio hostess and scorer. We also needed a good publicity stunt to draw attention to the show. The popular press are always up for a picture of a pretty girl, so I came up with the notion of a sort of public beauty contest. If nothing else, it would give me the opportunity to meet some very attractive young ladies. I was looking for girls between 18 and 20, attractive, with a lively personality and a keen interest in pop music. You can imagine we were overwhelmed with applications, and I invited 6 finalists to London for the judging. Well, I'm no Eric Morley, I couldn't afford the Brill cream, so I asked singer Anita Harris, controller Robin Scott, and another producer, Keith Stewart, to help me with the judging, and the winner was a very attractive redhead from Worcestershire, Tricia Madden. Tricia excelled at the job and benefited from the subsequent press exposure because when the BBC Colour service on BBC Two was launched, she became BBC Two's Colour Girl. In 1968, one of the most famous radio personalities finally joined Britain's favourite. That was Jimmy Savile, and I will come back to him and all that story towards the end of this book. By the end of 1968, as a reward for services rendered to Radio 1, Robin Scott was promoted to run BBC Two. Pity about that. Robin was a lovely man, much loved by all, and too good at what he did to stand still for long. He was replaced by the much straighter Douglas Muggeridge, who obviously thought it a good idea if we did a little more public service amongst all this pop stuff. I suppose at that time the most outstanding broadcaster, though, was Kenny Everett. At the end of 1967, Kenny had been given his own series on Sunday mornings, but for his whole life he had been obsessed by radio. He was born Maurice Cole in Liverpool on Christmas Day 1944. He was raised a Catholic by a very loving family, his mum Elizabeth, nicknamed Lily, and his dad Tom, who was a mate on a tugboat. Kenny, like me, had grown up listening to the Light programme and the Home Service and persuaded his dad to buy him a tape recorder, and he started fiddling about with his own recordings. He had a good ear and the gift of perfect pitch. He struggled at school as he tried to come to terms with his natural inclinations and affinity for those of his own sex, so he tied with the idea of joining the church. Fortunately for British radio, he decided against that and started sending off tapes to the BBC Home Service. It was Wilfred Diath who saw his potential and gave him his first ever BBC broadcast on the Home Services midweek. That didn't lead to any regular employment on the Home Service, and he pitched at the Light programme to an unimpressed Derek Chinnery. No luck there, so when he heard about the new pirate radio station Radio London, he put together another tape and got a job. Although he hated being at sea, he revelled in the chance to eat, live and breathe radio for 3 weeks at a time. He experimented with 2 tape machines and found he could build up a little choir by recording a basic melody on one machine. He then played that back into a second machine, adding his second voice in harmony. By repeatedly bouncing, he could make a regular choir singing little ditties and jingles to enhance his DJ links. Kenny also discovered that if you took the left and right channel of a stereo record and connected them out of phase, the vocal in the middle of the original disc would disappear, leaving Kenny with the backing track. Perfect for singing his own words over the original recording, and more entertainment for the listeners. Kenny used his knowledge of phase changing to create all kinds of special effects. He shared his enthusiasm with another Liverpudlian, John Lennon, and between them they started what John called flanging. It gave that strange spacey effect used on some Beatle records at the time. This was a time too when LSD was in widespread use. As Kenny put it to me, "It's the nearest you can get to listening to something on acid." He would know because John kept Kenny supplied with those little pills at that time. By July 1968, Kenny was doing so well that he and Angela Bond were given a daily evening show, which took even more preparation. Such were the creative demands that even Kenny couldn't maintain that volume of output, so he was moved to Saturday mornings. Being the type of character he was, he often spoke his mind without thought for the consequences. Even during his days on Radio London, he'd been in hot water for coughing his way through a cigarette commercial. Another sin was taking the mickey out of the religious programme paid for by the Worldwide Church of God, an organisation fronted by Garner Ted Armstrong. And years later, many will remember his appearance alongside Margaret Thatcher in his exhortation to bomb Russia, which got him into extremely hot water. Somewhat earlier, Kenny had been repeatedly warned by BBC management not to keep making adverse comments to the press about the Musicians' Union, and what Kenny saw as the ludicrous state of affairs regarding needle time, the limitation on playing records. Kenny couldn't keep his opinions to himself, and when interviewed by one of the music papers let loose not very tactfully on the facts as he saw them about the BBC and Radio 1 in particular. This was in direct breach of his contract, and unknown to Kenny caused management some embarrassment, as they were in the middle of delicate negotiations for more needle time. The last straw was when, in the course of his Saturday show, he made some indelicate remarks about the Minister of Transport's wife passing her advanced driving test by cramming a fiver into the examiner's hand. In retrospect, we could all see it was Kenny's idea of a joke, but it was sadly the last straw, and Managing Director Ian Trethowne insisted that Kenny was fired, just like that. I was furious, not that I was the producer involved, but I'd championed Kenny from the beginning, and I wrote a letter pleading for tolerance to MD Trethowne. I said the BBC should make allowance for genius, but to no avail. For the time being, that was that. Despite a public Bring Back Everett campaign, initiated by Kenny, he was out. I still think it was the wrong decision and diminished the BBC in the eyes of our audience. We should have been big enough to make allowances for him. All this took place in July 1970. That week I was on a train with another up-and-coming DJ. I was on my way to produce Radio 1 Club at Weymouth. The DJ was Noel Edmonds, and when we arrived at the venue, the ballroom at the end of Weymouth Pier, there was a message for Noel to call Mark White, Radio 1's head of programmes. "Noel, we want you to take over Kenny Everett's Saturday show from next week." Noel gulped hard and was in two minds. He knew there'd be a big backlash against the BBC for sacking Kenny, and he knew how popular Kenny was with the audience. On the other hand, it was a fantastic opportunity. "Johnny, what shall I do? How can I hope to fill Everett's shoes?" "Oh, just go on and be yourself, Noel," I said. "You have the talent, and in time people will accept you for yourself, just as good but different from Kenny." And so it proved to be. It was the start of another fabulous career in radio for another of the most creative DJs to appear on Radio 1. Noel had actually come to our notice a year earlier, in July 1969. He'd come from Radio Luxembourg, and his first breakthrough came by making trailers in the presentation department. Because he had an original approach to the subject, he was soon noticed by programme makers. He then started to do a number of Radio 1 on-air competitions, and after a few months, Popular Music Department used him to present 7 weeks of Pop Workshop. It only had sufficient needle time for 2 or 3 records, so he had to fill up the time with sessions and his own innovative sketches. In February, Kenny had the flu, and Noel deputised at short notice and was then offered a series on Saturday afternoons until I spotted his potential and he started to present Radio 1 Club. Kenny's sudden departure provided the break he needed. Another major personality on the network in those days was Stuart Henry. Stuart had always been a reluctant pirate on a ship off Scotland, where he suffered terribly from seasickness, so he was glad to come ashore as the token Scot on the network. His show, first on Sunday and later Saturday mornings, was produced by Aidan Day. Aidan and Stuart generated much interest in a special write-in slot in which he attempted to re-establish communications between parents and young people who had run away from home. "She's Leaving Home." It attracted a great deal of attention and some criticism on the grounds of dubious taste, but they persevered and it became compulsive listening. There was no shortage of on-air talent. What we had to do now was ensure we continued to meet the aspirations of the listeners, many of whom were still frustrated that the BBC still had not provided a pop service as good as their beloved pirates. We had to find other ways to please them. There was no room for complacency, but that limitation on playing commercial records, or needle time as it was called, was giving us problems. Chapter 6. Some cunning stunts. How music pluggers do their jobs. Companies know that the public are most likely to buy the latest single by an artist if it has been aired on the most popular music station in the country. The proof of that is Radio Luxembourg, where the entire programme output is made up of programmes paid for by individual record companies. You may wonder, why were song promoters called pluggers? The origins of this go back to before the war and can be laid at the feet of one Captain L.F. Pluge, who started the first ever offshore commercial radio station, Radio Normandy. The chief announcer there was Bob Danvers Walker, whose voice was later to become known to everyone through the cinema. Remember the Gaumont British and later Pathé newsreels. And of course much later he starred on Noel Edmonds' Sunday morning programme on Radio 1. Anyway, Captain Pluge's commercials became known as plugs and the name stuck. Radio Normandy closed in 1939 with the outbreak of World War II, but the generic description of pluggers as people who promoted music lived on. After the war, plugging became a lot more subtle. There had been an inquiry into these dodgy practices, though no one was found guilty of corruption, and as far as I could see, the BBC remained pretty well free of payola. The music industry was booming. For every record that was issued, someone owned the publishing of the song, and a record company owned the performance. So inevitably there were more and more pluggers employed in an increasingly competitive market. This meant that in my time as a controller there were over 100 plugging applications every week from publishers and record companies seeking appointments. The producers would never have time to listen to all the singles and albums issued if there was a plugger knocking on the door every 5 minutes, so there had to be access restrictions. There was only so much needle time, and this army of pluggers would resort to a range of tactics to draw producers and DJs' attention to their particular item. Here are a few pluggers' stories. Richard Evans. Richard is a Nottingham lad who started at Decca and became promotion boss of Epic Records and later as an independent. He was the source of much fun and laughter in our world. This is what he said. You have to remember that many of the producers were going to lunch in some of the finest restaurants in London, often taken in a limousine like royalty. To make a difference, as a plugger you had to make a noise, stand out from the others. There were perhaps 60 or 70 new singles every week coming out, and Radio 1 was only adding a small number of those to its playlist, so it wasn't hard if the artist was well known, but if it was unknown, you had to make a distinctive statement. One of the more intelligent pluggers was Alan James, and he told me, "I found it degrading all that queuing to see producers and I refused to do it. Later, when the appointment system was introduced, it was a little better, but I knew it took time, and my first lesson as a plugger was that until you knew the producers well and they knew you, you couldn't break through that barrier. Once a relationship had been established, then you were aware of the areas where they might be flexible. It was a matter of learning how each individual producer approached his job." But Alan found another way to obtain producers' time. He joined the Radio 1 football team. He said, "I realised certain formalities were being broken as far as I was concerned when Radio 1 senior man Teddy Warwick approached me to play in the Radio 1 football team. What an honour." I believe Teddy selected us because he had seen the aggressive way we fought our way through the milling pluggers to get to Radio 1's 4th floor. There were only 11 men in the team, so that route wasn't open to many. In order to get the producer's attention any length of time, there was a lot of lunchtime entertaining. There were some producers who looked after big shows who could lunch every day for weeks. Pluggers had to book lunch appointments months ahead. And then there were abuses too by the pluggers who could charge these lunches to their expense accounts. One chap was fired from EMI because he paid off a restaurant to give him a receipt pad on which he would enter fictitious bills for lunch to various producers. Unfortunately, he was not that clever and forgot that the receipts had consecutive numbers, so it wasn't long before an accountant at EMI spotted the fiddle and out he went. On other occasions, record companies or their managers would collaborate in a stunt to promote a particular act. A typical one was pulled by Rocket Records when they launched their label. In April 1973, they hired a steam train to go from Paddington to Moreton-in-the-Marsh in the Cotswolds. On board were a whole crowd of music business people, producers, journalists and so on, out on a mystery tour. When we got to the Cotswolds village, we trooped into the village hall where the first signing, Long Dancer featuring Dave Stewart, performed a selection of numbers from the album. Much food and drink was consumed, and everyone went away with a copy of the Long Dancer album in a very attractive tapestry shopping bag. From my position, I wasn't always aware of the detail of what was going on at the time, so I spoke to several of the more imaginative promotion men who passed on some of the stories behind their more successful stunts. Back to Alan James. In his time, Alan worked on the staff of ABC Records, then later as an independent promotion man. During his career, he worked with Toyah Willcox, Kim Wilde, The Tourists, later to become the Eurythmics, Chaz and Dave, Bryan Adams, numerous heavy metal bands, Deep Purple, Van Halen, Twisted Sister, Whitesnake, Rick Wakeman, and even Slade. He also worked with Elton John and his then manager, John Reid, for a long time. He told me, Elton and I did a flight around the UK in a private jet with Song for Guy. It was an outrageous 3 days, but the song got to number 2. This was in 1978, and even then it cost £100 an hour for the jet, but there was a European final football match, Nottingham Forest versus Malmo. So we sat in a room by the runway watching the match while the plane ran up a bill as we waited for the match to end. We then got on a plane and flew to Manchester. We were 2 hours late. Well, promotion men like Alan have to be resourceful and versatile. For the band Deep Purple, Alan took Tony Ashton to do an interview with Stuart Henry in Radio Luxembourg. But on the journey, Tony got so drunk he fell asleep and was unable to speak, so Stuart interviewed Alan for an hour and probably had a more coherent discussion of the album than he would otherwise have done. Although some producers like pluggers because they're able to help with access to artists for interviews and exclusives, not all the producers were fans. Alan recalled a run-in he had with Radio 1 producer Ron Belcher. Ron Belcher once called me a parasite. We were at Paul Burnett's where he was giving a party and I was in Paul's kitchen and Ron Belcher was there and introduced me to his wife, Rita. She said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "I annoy your husband by giving him a hard time about records I want him to play on his programmes." "You can't tell my Ron anything about music, he knows everything," said Rita. Ron then chipped in, "He's a fucking parasite. Always out with the DJs and sucking up to them." Things got a bit out of hand then, and DLT and Paul had to drag him away from the kitchen. Derek Chinnery was there, and on Monday I got a phone call from him apologising for Ron's behaviour. The following Tuesday I turned up for my regular appointment with Ron and he welcomed me as if nothing had happened. Sometimes a promotion man does much more than get airplay on a record. In the case of Bryan Adams, Alan claims to be the person responsible for making him a star in the UK. This is how he says it happened. There used to be a UK-based plugger called Anya Wilson. She married a Canadian, Larry LeBlanc, and we kept in touch, and from time to time she sent me albums of acts she thought might be of interest to me. One was Bryan Adams on A&M Records. I went to see Tony Burfield of A&M here, and I told him I thought Bryan was potentially a huge star. He was surprised, but he paid me to go to Toronto to meet Bryan's manager, Bruce Allen, who then flew me on to Los Angeles to see Bryan play at Oakland Stadium. I remember it was a very hot day, but I thought he had the same charisma as Rod Stewart. He really knew how to communicate with the audience, and he said to the girls, "If I take my T-shirt off, will you?" And in a flash I saw 100 pairs of breasts swinging in the sunlight. Wow, I thought, I've got to promote this guy. He had a single out called Cuts Like a Knife. I came back and convinced A&M. We took Jeff Griffin of In Concert and Television's Mike Appleton to Paris to see the concert, and as a result Bryan came over to do the Old Grey Whistle test and In Concert, and he's never looked back since. Now he's more successful here than in Canada. Next, Oliver Smallman. Ollie is another quiet, independent promotion man who worked with Richard Evans. He's a very quietly spoken individual, dresses modestly, and to look at him you would think he probably works in an insurance office, which belies the mischief within him. He told me Billy Idol had a row with his record company, Chrysalis, but they had the album and a single, White Wedding, from it, and they needed to sell it. So Chrysalis asked me as an independent promoter to befriend Billy and see if I could help. Our first meeting wasn't promising. "Are you another wanker full of piss and wind?" he said. "Tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it." Well, I wasn't too impressed, as he always said that, but really did deliver. I said to Chrysalis boss Chris Wright, "If you put out White Wedding, Richard Evans and I have an idea for a stunt." We went to Pro Nuptia to hire a wedding dress. I said to the assistant, "It's not for my wife, it's for me." The woman didn't blink but measured me up and got out a range of dresses. "Do you need shoes?" "Yes, please, size 9s. When we were kitted out, I was the bride and Richard dressed as Billy the groom. He must have had a great life, because it was certainly one of the best days Richard ever spent. Free booze and drugs all day. We employed a BBC make-up girl for £30, and by 6 o'clock in the morning we were in full kit. We ambled our way over to Radio 1 to give away mini wedding cakes with Billy Idol iced on them, and after finishing photos and promotion at Radio 1, we had to go over to Capital Radio. En route, we were seen by a bunch of Japanese tourists who immediately started snapping away. They must have thought London a very funny place, but the record was a hit. Now, as you can tell from that story, the independent pluggers were often brought in to bail out the promotion staff employed by the parent record companies. Such a move also served to gratify the ego of a major artist, to know that he or she was getting additional promotional effort. Not all stunts were pulled in radio. Oliver and Richard weren't averse to tackling television producers. They told me for a while Michael Hurl on Top of the Pops set very early appointment times for pluggers, 7:30 in the morning. So Richard Evans and I bribed our way in at 06:30. We went into his office dressed as Boy Scouts, set up a tent and a cooking stove on which we cooked eggs and bacon. When Michael arrived, he had to laugh, and soon after he stopped all that early nonsense. We're back with Richard Evans. He said, "God did this wonderful thing when on day 4 he invented gramophone records, because on day 5 he invented radio stations that wouldn't play them. I was so naive that when I started I had a Lindisfarne record and I took it to John Peel. He said, 'Go home, little boy, I've been playing it for weeks.' That was his first lesson. Listen to the programme you're plugging. But unfortunately he was a quick learner. I just got a job at Decca. I'd been there about 6 months and I had to get a record onto Junior Choice. And I knew that to do this I needed to take out the producer Don George for lunch. Don was a legendary luncher and there was a waiting list to take him out. Decca had a subsidiary label, York Records, owned by Deke Arlen. And as I was not doing very well with them, Deke hired his brother-in-law, Phil Betts, who was a schoolteacher, to do the plugging. It was my job to introduce him to everyone. After months of negotiating, I managed to fix a lunch with Don George. I had booked us into a converted barge, the Bark and Bite, on the Regent's Canal. At 11 that morning, Don phoned. I was dreading he was going to cancel, but no, my son's very ill and I have to take him to hospital, but I'm still coming for lunch. I just want you to know I'm going to be a bit late. So Phil and I went to the restaurant, had a gin and tonic while we waited. Don turned up eventually, very apologetic. We were sitting with our backs against the wall and Don sat down opposite to us. The menus came, Don got stuck into a G&T and the wine, and we started to talk. Don was a devout Catholic, and I'd warned Phil, who was very left-wing, to stay off politics, but this was early February 1972, a week or so after Bloody Sunday. Inevitably we got onto this topic, and from there, before I had a chance to interrupt, it moved into the Catholic religion and homosexuality. I knew then I'd lost control. I tried every way to change the subject, but to no avail. I could do nothing except listen as these two were locked in heated debate. Don made some politically incorrect statement to the effect that all puffs should be burned at the stake. Phil retorted, and before I knew it, Don had picked up the menu and was slapping Phil round the head with them. This amused the other diners until Don picked up the open bottle of Mouton Cadet and made to hit Phil with it. Of course, the wine started to fly everywhere. Worse, sitting still behind him was a woman from the Sunday Times who was banged over the head by Don's backstroke. By this time I was about ready to cry. I was only saved by the waiters who dragged Don off Phil and threw him out into the street. Well, I didn't know what to do. I could not imagine Don was going to play our record after that, and I was sure I was going to be fired. I had visions of being banned from Radio 1 forever. What could I do? I ordered a bottle of champagne for us. Phil and I finished our lunch, had a couple of large brandies while we considered my future. While I was still in the restaurant, digesting the brandy, the waiter came over with a message. "There's a phone call for you, sir." It was Don. "Richard," he said, "that man Phil's a homosexual. He was touching me up under the table." "Well, Don, he's married with 3 kids, so I'm surprised," covering my arse, "but I'll make sure everyone knows about him." When I got back to the office, Deke Arlen was all in favour of suing Don George. But my intention was to cover it up, and my boss, Don Wardell, was also in favour of smoothing everything over. I then had a phone call from Don George's boss at the BBC, Teddy Warwick, who asked me to come in and give my side of the story, which luckily Teddy believed, as he said, "If Phil had been a homosexual, Don George is the last person he would have touched up." So I lived to plug some more. That same Don George was invited to a playback of Tony Christie's new album. He turned up and he asked, "Where do I sit for my meal?" "There is no meal, Don. It's a playback of the new album with a drink and a few cocktail nibbles while it's playing." "What?" said Don. "My invite clearly said album lunch." "No, Don, read it again. It says album launch." He walked out. After he left Decca, Richard teamed up with Oliver Smallman, and they formed an independent promotion company called Positive Promotion. In our office block in North Row, West 1, someone knew a couple of East End villains. One did all the chatting while the other one hardly ever spoke. Sometimes they'd come in with dodgy goods, clothes, carpets or whatever, and we'd give them records in return, because they were quite funny and they made us laugh. On our office walls we had lots of gold discs from hits we had made, and these chaps had been there on several occasions when the quiet one looked around, put his brain into gear and said, "Are you two anything to do with the music business then?" We told them what we did. It was record plugging for a living, and he said, "You couldn't get my daughter tickets for Top of the Pops, could you?" I had the right contact, so I said I could probably fix it. "If you do that," he said, "I'll kiss your arse." Pause. "But then again, I suppose that doesn't mean very much in your profession." Richard knew his way around Egton House and the whole BBC, and one day he spotted another opportunity which he was quick to exploit. Not all their gimmicks worked. If it was a bad record, no stunt would get it on the air. Steve Ellis from Love Affair, he had a disc called Rag and Bone, so I got my fixer man to hire a genuine Steptoe-type Rag and Bone man's cart, complete with horse to tow it. He was the real thing, operating out of Shepherd's Bush, and he turned up to take me to Radio 1 on the cart. It was a winter's day, and I'm dressed up in a flat cap with all the right gear, and the Rag and Bone man turned up in his best Sunday suit, because he thought for the BBC he ought to look posh. I met him in Maddox Street, and I put a load of records in the back of the cart to deliver to Egton House. We got as far as Oxford Circus, and the poor old horse fell down dead. I was left standing there with the poor chap in despair, and I never did get to Radio 1, and Steve Ellis didn't have a hit. Richard was actually very straight in the so-called drug-crazed world of pop. He said, "I was driving Jose Feliciano one night and the manager said, 'Hey Richard, can you get us some coke?' So I stopped off by the off-licence and bought 2 cans. They didn't seem at all grateful, I don't know why. What a lovely job for a poor boy to have." Christmas gifts were tricky because producers were not allowed to accept anything which could be construed as a bribe, so there were guidelines about the value of any present offered by business contacts. This brought Richard into conflict with the management. Derek Chinnery always suspected pluggers were up to no good, and he was probably right. In 1979, video players had just come out. They cost £500 each, so I wrote to Derek and said, "I've come by a number of them and I want to give one to every producer for Christmas." Derek said this was quite out of order and not acceptable, so I sent all the producers a bottle of scotch and a copy of Derek's letter. Next, Judd Lander. Judd is a lovely Liverpudlian who has worked in the music business all his life. He plays a very mean harmonica and is also pretty competent on the bagpipes. He's always up for a laugh and again originated some of the best plugging stunts ever. He said, in 1977 I had a record called Black Betty by the Ram Jam Band, and I was finding it hard to get anyone interested, so I hired a black lady actress and dressed her as a cleaner. I bribed the commissionaire at Egton to let her in, and off she went dressed as Mrs. Mop, knocking on producers' doors, apologising for being late in coming in to do the office cleaning. I gave her some cock and bull story to tell them about her kid being sick, etc., and as she was cleaning the office, she struck up a conversation with the chaps, telling them all about her son being in a band, and how she'd got a record of him, and would they listen to it. It worked beautifully. The guys were sympathetic, and the record made the playlist and went to number 7 in the charts that September. And just in case you think it sounds easy and good fun, it wasn't always so. If things went wrong, the plugger was always the first to get the blame. Judd says, I popped into the Beeb early one evening to drop off a few records. Van Morrison had also arrived with his manager Kellogg's. They were pre-recording an interview with Janice Long, where she was supposed to discuss his all-time favourite records. The young lady plugger from Polydor had given Janice a list, and after much corridor grumbling, Van Morrison arrived and sat down for the interview. All went well until Janice asked him about his first choice, an old blues song. He retorted to words to the effect that I can't stand that bloody track. So Janice bravely moved on to his second choice and got a similar reaction from the curmudgeonly Irishman. He wasn't being difficult, he just didn't want to do the interview at all, and finished up bollocking the poor girl from Polydor for mucking it up, and having a brawl with his manager too as they left the building. Stars, who needs them? All the promotion in the world cannot break a bad record, but in a competitive situation it did often draw attention to things that might have been missed. In those days there were lots of laughs, and in the end it was all to raise the profile. As one plugger said, by the mid-80s it stopped being fun, and it went over to pure marketing. Everyone wanted to get into the charts. Chapter 7. The Radio 1 Club. When we were a year old in 1968, Robin was allowed to slightly increase the separation between radios 1 and 2. One of the first time slots to separate was at lunchtimes, where those unspeakable big band shows had held sway. Derek Chinnery and I put our heads together and, taking up the old idea of pop-in, decided to rework it and expand it into a full-blown club for Radio 1 listeners. The club premises would be our Paris studio in Lower Regent Street, London. There we would stage a broadcast, have live groups playing, and interview anyone who had out a halfway decent record. Radio 1 fans could join. Initially we would do shows in London, but later it was our intention to travel it round the country so that listeners could have a chance to see and hear their favourite DJs in the flesh. We started the ball rolling by putting a smallish notice in the Radio Times inviting potential members to apply for free membership. The first 10,000 applicants were offered a lapel badge, and everyone would get a membership card entitling them to win prizes and attend the shows. I had no idea of the size of Radio 1's appeal. After a week we had over 15,000 applications, and the postbag was growing daily as sacks of these applications rolled in. How on earth would we handle them all? Derek came up with the notion of approaching the NAYC, the National Association of Youth Clubs. They offered to help for free in return for attendant publicity. It was one heck of a job for amateurs. Derek and I set up the youngsters on the floor of one of our larger studios, S1, in the basement of Broadcasting House, and our secretaries, Jane Paramore and Jill Thomas, supervised them as they set about turning out the sacks of mail and stuffing envelopes as fast as they could. We organised free cokes for all, and some of the DJs came down to give their encouragement as we tried to make it as much fun as possible. After a couple of weeks we'd broken the back of it and managed to send out a significant proportion of the cards before the club opened its doors. On the launch day I arranged for singer Mary Hopkin to come in and give Robin Scott membership card number 1. Do you remember her hit, Those Were the Days, My Friend? Radio 1 Club was huge, but staging it was not without problems. When we had launched Radio 1, we'd come up against the problem that there were no studios where DJs could play their own records. Similarly, for this show I needed what was effectively a mobile broadcast DJ desk with the same equipment that we had in the continuity studios. There was much arguing with the Jobsworth who controlled the studios and the engineers about this, but eventually I got my own way. Next, we needed it to look like a club, so I wanted Radio 1 promotional displays and scenery. Scenery in a radio show? Who ever heard of such a thing, Mr. Beerling? And if we make it for you, whose job is it to erect it? Not mine, said the studio attendant. We're here to set out the chairs and the microphones. You can imagine the petty arguments. Mr. Beerling, we can't allow the public into one of our audience shows without a ticket. It's just not been done. But eventually the sticking points were all overcome, and we went on the air with the first show on Monday, October the 21st, in a packed Paris studio. Keith Skews, sitting at his DJ desk on a raised platform, stage right, was the host, while in front of him the tremolos played live. Elsewhere, Tony Blackburn supported Keith by acting as guest interviewer. It was all right, great fun, and took off right from the start. As one member put it, "It's just too good to be true. My favourite group's playing live and I can see them in my lunch hour for free." How could it fail? Even the old lady knitters who dominated the Paris were won over. Our credibility was slightly tarnished on December the 23rd, 1970, when I was producing Radio 1 Club in London. For some reason, Tommy Vance, better known as an advocate of heavy metal music, had not arrived to introduce the show. The red light went on. We couldn't have silence, so there was nothing for it but to introduce it for myself. I was doing a Don George. Luckily Tommy arrived after 15 minutes and the listeners were spared any more of my efforts. It had been a long time since my DJ work in Aden. We were always conscious that we were a national station and of the need to break away from that perception that we were that station down there in London. So within a month I started to set up the shows with 2 locations at once. This was to put me and a team of producers on the road for the next 3 years. What had I started? In a nutshell, we were taking Radio 1 to its audience instead of waiting for them to come to us. For the first doubleheader we chose London and a BBC regional club premises that was the top-rank suite in Birmingham. Through the magic of radio, everyone at each end could hear all that was going on, and in this way we could have 2 DJs on the air and 2 live groups. It also gave us the chance to give exposure to up-and-coming new groups emerging outside London. As the months and years went on, we travelled the length and breadth of the country, from Arisaig in Scotland to Plymouth and across to Northern Ireland. It was fun, but it was very hard work, and the producers, myself included, were soon suffering from battle fatigue. We had to travel to the location with the star DJ the day before the show, spend the evening in research with the local ballroom manager. Well, we call them planning meetings, but it usually involved drinking far too much in the interests of improving relations. Next morning we had to be on the site at 7 a.m. to oversee the setup and then rehearse the band through its 4 or 5 numbers. A cold, empty ballroom at dawn is not a very hospitable place. Imagine a bunch of rock and roll musicians trying to run through their set while half asleep and suffering from acute hangovers. Drums and guitars have the capacity to be really loud and annoying when your head hurts badly. I can assure you it's not an experience to be savoured on a regular basis. Everything had to be finished by 11 a.m, ready to let the audience in for the live show, which started at 12. In those days the BBC had a strong regional presence, and in each region our Radio 1 producer worked with the local light entertainment man. He would use his local knowledge to find suitable venues, groups, local DJs and stars to make personal appearances. Because of the union rules, we were unable to use our regular studio managers who had an expertise in balancing pop groups, so we couldn't create the best sound. Instead, we were required to use outside broadcast engineers who could be covering a football match on one day and Radio 1 Club the next. Some of them were very good and did their best. Others were, to put it bluntly, grumpy old buggers who hated pop music, and you were lucky if they managed to get the vocal mic opened when the lead singer started to sing. Ben Lyons was the local light entertainment man in Scotland, and he was a kindly man, though getting on in years, who did his best to get with it. The engineers, though, were always wont to have a laugh at Ben's expense, and Ben was always keen to add lots of echo to the singers and guitarists. He thought it made for a more commercial pop sound. He was frequently heard shouting at the engineers over the high-volume speakers, "Give me more echo, please!" so one day they gave him control of one of the sound mixer knobs. They said they were making a big concession to union rules and would allow him to control the amount of echo by opening it as he wished. It was labelled Ben's Echo Fader. The band went on air, and Ben was thrilled as they played their set. He kept winding his little fader up and down to get the result he required. There was only one problem. The fader was not connected to anything, but it did keep Ben happy, and I'm not sure if anyone did ever tell him. One week we were up in Scotland doing a Radio 1 club from the Stewarton Youth Club with Alan Freeman. The show had gone very well, and my boss Derek Chinnery had decided to come and join us. As this show was one of several promotional broadcasts in Scotland, I had prevailed on Audi to lend us a press demonstration vehicle with which to ferry the DJs and Derek around. The car they loaned us was a then top-of-the-range CD100 in pure white, and very smart it looked too. We left the club fairly late, and I decided to drive my secretary, Jeanette Kivell, and Derek Chinnery to our hotel in Kilmarnock. It was a very wet and windy night, and I was high on the success of the evening, and perhaps 1 or 2 glasses of the Scottish wine as we bowled along a dark country lane. Derek turned to me and said quite calmly and casually, "Johnny, I don't think we're going to make the next bend." "Nonsense," I replied. "This is an Audi, and they go round corners like trains on rails." And just as I said this, we took off in a most spectacular way and came to rest on top of a low hedge. To make matters worse, it was a hedge enveloped in barbed wire, most of which was by now wrapped around the not-sparkling car. I did feel a prat as we struggled out of the hedge onto the road. Luckily we were unhurt, and fortunately the youth club was run by a very kindly police officer, Ian McKee. We phoned him to explain our predicament, and he was able to arrange for a tow truck. Such was the position of the car, it was impossible to tow us out, so the driver had to resort to craning out the damaged vehicle. Next morning, in the cold light of day, we inspected the car at the garage. It was clear there was no major damage, but no panel of paintwork had escaped scratching, so I was not the most popular BBC person when I had to explain to Audi's press office what had happened. As time went on, Radio 1 Club started to have a few problems. In Falkirk, the headmaster wouldn't allow the boys and girls to leave school at lunchtime to attend the show. Some of the pupils planned a sit-in as a protest and were only persuaded to call it off at the last minute after the head threatened even more punishment. The club continued in this lunchtime format for 3 years, by which time we had been to about 150 different locations. Now with the problems, it looked as though it was time for a Radio 1 Club rethink. When the lunchtime club closed its doors, it had over 280,000 members. We rejigged the schedule, and the show was moved to 2 hours in the early evening. With Radio 1 Club we were showing a new way of satisfying our audience, and in the years it was on the road, the Radio 1 Club probably went to more locations and met more of its listeners than any other BBC programme.